let us go ahead and get started. Uh, Again, like I said, I just want to say welcome to everybody and thank you for making time to join us here at the Carl Spain Center for this important conversation and to be a part of this dialogue, but also a part of providing solutions as we'll have breakout groups toward the end of our time together. I just want to, at this time, take an opportunity to introduce not only the founder of the Carl Spain Center, but a great mentor and friend, Dr. Jerry Taylor, uh, who is, as I said, the director of the Carl Spain Center. And at this time, I will let Dr. Taylor begin with his opening remarks, and he'll also introduce our first speaker today. But before I make that transition, let me give a couple housekeeping rules. As many of you are already aware of, everybody's on mute. We're asking you to keep your devices on mute at this time. We will allow you to unmute when we get into our breakout groups. On your device, if you would actually change it from gallery view to speaker view, it might be a little bit helpful in terms of keeping up with the presenters so you don't have to worry about all the distractions from what's going on with everyone else. And as you can see, there's a chat option. If you have any questions, comments during any of the comments of any of our speakers' presentations, feel free to shoot those comments. I'll be receiving those and we'll make sure to do our best to try to get those included or to get you answers if time permits. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Dr. Jerry Taylor.
Okay, we are so delighted to have everybody on this virtual meeting today. I'd like for us to begin with the awareness of God's divine presence with us and around us and within us. This work is too much for human intelligence that is divorced from the wisdom of God. Too often we have sought solutions to social problems without seeking to develop and deepen our spiritual understanding of how the creator of life expects for us to reverence and to appreciate human lives that he has created in his divine image. And so we gather here today for the purpose of studying a subject matter that we have prayed over, we have meditated over, we have saturated ourselves with scripture, and we have prayed and fasted and opened our hearts to be receptive to divine wisdom that God can download into our lives so that we can then speak and act in accordance with that divine wisdom with the hope of influencing the social structures and institutions of which we are part. This discussion of police reform is not intended to be an attack or an assault on those who have been tasked with the responsibility to provide us with safety and protection. However, this is a discussion that has been rooted in prayer with the hope that we can think together and pray together and come to a consensual understanding of the best direction that we can take moving forward to offer input on how we can achieve responsible police reform in our society. So we want to thank you for taking time to be present in this virtual space and to open your hearts and to be receptive to what will be shared with us on today. I am especially honored to have the opportunity to introduce a man who has had a profound, lasting impact upon my life. I have seen in him a desire to engage in healthy conversations across lines of race and to do so from a place that keeps intact the humanity of the other. And that is the person, in the person of Dr. Nelson N. Johnson. He is the founding pastor emeritus at Faith Community Church in Greensboro, North Carolina. He is also the co-executive director of the beloved Community Center of Greensboro, which was organized in 1991 to carry out the dream of the 20th century prophet, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He currently serves as the North Carolina Steering Committee and National Executive Committee of the New Poor People's Campaign, which is also co-chaired by Dr. William Barber II and Dr. Liz Theo Harris. Dr. Johnson is also a member of the North Carolina Forward Together Moral Monday movement, the beloved Organizing and Training and Healing Institute, Democracy Greensboro, the Greensboro Pulpit Forum, the Healing Practitioners Team of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Mel King Community Fellows of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. He is also a survivor of the 1979 Greensboro Massacre, wherein 5 peaceful protesters were shot and killed in broad daylight in Greensboro, North Carolina. And so we are pleased to have Dr. Johnson with us today, and he will share with us his personal story of that experience that he had on that fateful day in 1979 in Greensboro. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
The nation. I want to thank all who and then we will talk.
Back to this direction, Sandy Smith was trying to get the children behind a community center. When she came back around to get some more children, that's when she was hit. The stump of the tree is the only thing out here that provides a little bit of a land marker for where things happen, because the bodies were on this side, and I really didn't know this tree had been cut down until I came out here today. But cutting of this tree is like unpiling the stones that the priests piled up when they crossed over the river Jordan, so that when your children's children ask what happened here, that tree would be a mechanism of memory so that we could tell the story. And unless we tell stories about the truth of our journey, then I'm afraid that we are locked into the worst of our yesterdays and therefore block the possibility of a bright tomorrow.
Am I on? Thank you. I want to say again how much I appreciate Dr. Taylor and how much I appreciate all of you who have joined your hearts and minds and spirits together to do this work that's much needed. I want to share a story of what happened in Greensboro on November 3rd, 1979. But to do that, I need to provide a little bit of context. You just saw people shooting, people dying, and people driving away. So I arrived in Greensboro in 1965. I was coming out of the United States Air Force where I did 4 years. And I enrolled as a student at North Carolina A&T State University. And I didn't know I was going to be organizing, but I started organizing pretty early on. I walked from where I had an apartment to the campus, but I had to walk through a poor community. And I started talking to people, and they started sharing with me in public housing the difficulties they were having in being treated decent, in mosquitoes and water ponds because a lot of non-paving space, and paying the bills. Sometimes the lights would be turned off and children were there and couldn't study. So I just started asking, what can we do? And we end up organizing the first organization in public housing in Greensboro in 1967 called the United Neighborhood Improvement Association. You might catch a little connection to that name. And we did a good job. And we built on that for 3 years and built the Greensboro Association of Poor People. This was a year before Dr. King's Poor People's March to Washington. And we brought together a network of organizations. We sent that piece to you. I don't know if you can pull it up now or a little later, but I'll just hold it up. The center of that was poor people in poor neighborhoods, starting with public housing, but in low-income communities. The clergy became a part of that. Black professional groups became a part of that. The sororities and the fraternities. Black youth became a part of that at the high school. We ended up bringing together, without even knowing it, the most powerful assembly of Black people in the last 100 years in Greensboro in the years of 67, 68, and 69. So I want you to see this powerful organization of Black people. And it was a number of us working together. And in 1969, I'll just share this brief piece. There was an election at the all-Black high school, Dudley High School. And there was a young man who ran for student government president, but the all-white school board would not allow him to be put on the ballot. After the community did all it could to try to persuade the school board to put him on the ballot, they refused to do it, so he was written in by his classmates, schoolmates, and he won 2-1. But the all-white school board would not allow him to be seated. Well, we were having a conference at A&T to form the National Student Black Organization for Black Unity, when these young people who had been tear gassed by the police and jailed, and their parents got them out of jail, it was raining, they walked into the building half wet, some with scars and marks on their arm, and said, y'all are here talking about Black power, but we've just been beaten up. And so I adjourned the meeting, and about 500 of us walked over to that high school. And I tried to talk to the principal, but he ran away. And I say he ran away. He just retreated into his office with the police. So we went in the gym, and I got on the table and said, by the authority of the Black community, we install Claude Brown Jr. as the duly elected president of the student government of Dudley High School. It was a big cheer, and we walked back to A&T about 3/4 of a mile. And then students start to, people start to come through and yell stuff at students and fire some shots into the campus, 1969. And there were vets from Vietnam. I was a vet. I was not a part of the Veterans Club, but they chose to defend the campus and said we didn't come back from Vietnam to be shot at on our own campus. So they actually blocked off the whole campus. You don't know this story. I know you don't know it because they don't tell our stories. And actually prevented any police or any white person from coming on the campus and held it for 3 days. The National Guard then came in, 650, and seized the campus, shot Willie Grimes in the back of the head, and the school was closed and didn't open again that year. Let me ask, if you've heard this story, just wave your hand. And that speaks to me. It was not Kent State. It was not these other schools. It was the largest HBCU in the nation. And that's what happened there in '69. I got a lot of blame for that because we brought the community together. And we eventually got the principal of the school to meet with us at Trinity AME Zion Church. But what a fighting man. I felt sorry for him because he was caught between his own community and a white board of education. And he just vacillated. But all of that is to say, by the mid-70s, we felt that I was a bit of a nationalist. I thought that white people really were the problem. And I thought that it was kind of ingrained in white people. I started to study Marxism, and I came to a different conclusion, that all of us wear the culture that we grew up in, and unless we're able to work our way through it and out of it, we actually just exemplify it, you know? And I think that's what was going on. So we set out to organize white workers. Greensboro is a textile town, and 5 textile mills in the city. And so we worked in those, went to what we call the point of production, and we studied Marxism and studied the theories thereof, and really was working off of that. I want to acknowledge that up front because I don't want you to discover that piece of my history. I thank God that while I appreciate that piece, I have grown spiritually, and that is no longer the ideology that I follow. But we were in the process of doing that work in 1979. And we were pretty good at it, if I must say so myself. We had organized workers in 5 plants, textile mills in Greensboro. We had organized workers in Danville, Virginia, in that plant, in Martinsville, Virginia, in Kannapolis, North Carolina, J.P. Stevens, in Rocky Mount. And I had taken a year out of school and was just going all over the state, working with people to organize these groups. Well, in the process of doing that, there were leaflets passed out in some of the plants we worked in, saying that this is nothing but a bunch of black people trying to use the union to get in charge of white people. And then we learned that the Klan was showing a movie, Birth of a Nation, I believe. in one of the towns we were organizing in. So we went down, held the demonstration, marched, and we exchanged insults to each other. Again, I want to acknowledge that's not exactly what I do now, but I did do it then. And we came back to Greensboro. And about 5 months later, it was clear to me that we had a wonderful group of black workers at 5 or 6 of those mills, but whose outlook actually had to be challenged. So we decided to call a labor conference, and we were going to bring together the black community that we had spent over 10 years working with, and workers, both black and white, from the mill, and to build the unity of these groups. It was going pretty good. And we decided to add a march to the conference, and the march would weave through the black community. And we had a flatbed truck. We had singers who were singing on the truck. We had people leafleting and would say, join the march. We had done this several times before, so we're pretty good at it. And you can start with 50 people and end up with 200 when you get to the site where you're going. And so that's what we were doing on November 3rd. I applied for a parade permit on the 19th of October, and you're only supposed to give them 3 days to give you an answer to it. But I didn't get an answer. And on the 1st of November, I finally went to the police department and demanded that they give me a parade permit, or that they tell me that they weren't, because we had people coming from all of these places with no parade permit. Well, they did give it to me, but what I didn't know is that they gave it to a Klans member at the very same time that they gave it to me. And they had written on it that you are prevented from having any weapons and prohibitions of that sort, and gave it to the Klan. What we did not know is that the Klan had been meeting in Lewisburg and Mooresville, and they had told the police that 85 of them were planning to come to Greensboro, that some of them had machine guns, and they had the Klan informant giving them this information. We had no knowledge of any of this. Some of the rhetoric we used, I would not use today, but it was freedom of speech. It wasn't, shooting anybody. And on that morning, and I want you to see the possibility of a community of black people who were pretty well organized, meeting with black and white workers coming out of the plant and building the unity thereof. Our plan was to meet at a holiness church that we had met at a number of times. And but 2 days before we met there, one of the mothers of the church informed us that a young lady who was a laborer in the police department, I don't know exactly what her job was, had been told that the Klan and Nazis said that if we met in the church, that they would throw dynamite into the church. And so we didn't have a place to meet. But a good restaurant owner gave us his place, which was right next door to the church down the street. So everything was in place. I met the police officer who gave me the permit. And when he told me that we could not be armed or otherwise, I said, who told you we plan to be armed? And the second thing is, it's not illegal in North Carolina to be armed. And the third thing I asked him is, do you know something that I don't know? Why are you talking about armed and disarmed? This is not, I've had a number of demonstrations. I've never had this discussion. He said, and he looked at me and said, if you want this parade permit, you sign this document or you won't get it. I'd already been delayed. So now I'm on November 1st with people coming on November 3rd. So I signed. I had no knowledge of the information I've just shared with you. On the early morning of November 3rd, 9 carloads of Klan and Nazis drove from around the state, from the west and east, into North Carolina. And I'd not heard of the Klan and Nazis being in unity with each other. That seemed, and I didn't know that they were even in town. They joined with the Klan's people in Greensboro. And the police had been told by the informant that our people have machine guns and they have a lot of weapons. So the Klansman got scared and said to the police, they gave him $50 for the information he was giving them, that y'all probably need to call this thing off. Well, they didn't call it off, they didn't tell us, and they didn't show up. So the Klan and Nazis drove 5 miles across the town with one police car behind them, unmarked. It was a car that took photographs. And they drove into Morningside Homes, a Black community. And actually, in the lead car, the informant shouted obscenities out of the window. And a young man sitting on the right side of the vehicle, I was looking right at him, raised his hand out of the window and fired a pistol into the air. Well, all the people who were standing close to him, and that was the front vehicle, started to run back. And when they were running back, the last vehicle, the 9th vehicle, opened this trunk. That's where you saw the people coming up with the gun. And they shot Jim Waller in the back, the president of the union at Hall River Mills. He was Jewish. They shot Cesar Corsay, Latino, through the heart. He was an organizer of non-academic workers at Duke University. They shot William Sampson in the heart. He was the lead organizer at the largest denim producing factory in the world, White Oak there in Greensboro. And they shot Sandy Smith, the former student government at the all-Black college, Bennett College. Some of you have heard of that. As she was trying to get children behind the building out of the danger of fire. And by the way, my 2 daughters, who were then 7 and 8, were there, and other children were there. They actually put their guns back in the car, smoking cigarettes, and drove off. I was wounded. A Nazi ran to me with a butcher knife and tried to stab me in my intestine. I blocked it with my arms. The knife went through my arms. And so I was standing there, seeing myself sitting in front of the desk, getting the parade permit, and seeing this Captain Gibson say, you know, you have to sign this saying y'all won't be armed. And I knew then in my spirit, you know, it isn't like I needed to read anything. I knew right then that this was no way this could have happened without the police being deeply involved in it. So I stood up over Jim's body, who had been shot in the back. I turned him over, he took his last breath. And I started to say, there is no way that this could have happened except the involvement of the police. Well, the police finally showed up. They came streaming in with sirens blaring. And their first thing was to come to me and say, you have to shut up, because people were gathering around. And I said, I'm not going to shut up. You know, I know what happened here, that we were standing here and just got shot up by the Klan and Nazis, and y'all were nowhere to be found. And you gave them, I didn't know then he had given them the parade permit. I found that out later in the court process. Well, I was arrested. I was bleeding from the stab wound, taken to the hospital, and they didn't give me a bond. they said that I was too dangerous to be let out that night. And I was bandaged up. And about 3 in the morning, 2 white men came in. One identified himself as the FBI and the other one as the police, and said, listen, Johnson, your name is on the lip of every Klan and Nazi members in the state of North Carolina. And your life is not worth a nickel unless you work with us. I actually knew what they were driving at. I was sitting on a little metal stool in about a 4x4 room, just the 3 of us in there. I turned my stool to the wall and didn't say anything. And they said, we'll rip this bandage off of your arm, and just other things like that. I just didn't say anything. And they finally left. I got out the next morning. I didn't know, my mind was on who had been shot because I didn't know. I saw Jim, he was dead. I saw Sandy, I thought she had died, but I didn't know where my girls were. And a friend from my brother from Winston-Salem had come over and picked them up and taken them to his home. The short version of this is that we were totally demonized after that. And we were blamed for luring the Klan into Greensboro, and that we had planned a shootout with them, but they were good old boys who knew how to shoot and knew how to hunt. And we were college boys who didn't know what we were doing, and they just took advantage of us. So I and 3 other people were arrested for inciting to riot after the incident. And the Klan and Nazis were charged with murder of 1st degree. And at one point, I was in jail. Their bond was $50,000. I was in jail at one point over $100,000 bond. And that's a way of looking at how the system was looking at it. Well, we had 2 trials. One was a murder trial, and it was an all-white jury, and all the Klan and Nazis were acquitted. We had a second trial, a federal trial, which was the violation of civil rights, and they said they didn't oppose civil rights, they were opposing communism, and so they were all acquitted. In 1985, we had, for the first time, those of us who were on the victim end of this brought a civil trial against the Klan and Nazis. And each one of these trials, by the way, went over 4 months. And you just have to imagine how much confusion can be introduced in a community with teams of lawyers going backwards and forth, making all kinds of accusations, and the newspaper printing the worst of them. And I argued that the people in Greensboro would have the least understanding of people in the nation because they were so thoroughly confused. And by the way, I think that we are going through something like that now, where people are just being confused. China did this, and drink Clorox and you'll get well, and just all kinds of nonsense. So after 4 months of trial, for the first time in the history of the United States, Klansmen, Nazis, and police officers were found jointly liable for one person's death, not 5. And they were ordered to pay $350,000. And that was Dr. Michael Nathan, who lived in Durham, who was there to provide medical help. And all the other people were workers in the plant, and they didn't fine for them at all. About 15 years later, I was visited by a black man. He said he was from High Point. I didn't recognize him, but he said he was, by the way, both of the first set of jurors were all white. The jury of the civil trial was 6 people and 1 was black. He came in and said that I'm the black man who was on the jury. I was stunned. I was glad to meet him. And he said, I want you to know that they were going to let all of them go. And he said, I'm not leaving until we get somebody convicted of something. And that's how I learned that that verdict came out. For those who think it doesn't make much difference whether people are on juries or not, we never would have gotten that. And by the way, what that opened up for us was a treasure trove of information that you get through deposition that we never would have had, because the cover stories and falsehoods of the first 2 trials, we didn't have access to the information. So we were able to win that victory. But this experience was just burned into the depths of the internality of the consciousness of people of Greensboro. And I have had a good friend who ran a restaurant, and we used to go there and have a bite to eat and sit together. He came to me one day almost with tears in his eyes and said, listen, Nelson, he was an engineer. He was black, went to North Carolina State, and said, you know, y'all can't meet here anymore, because the insurance company called me and told me if y'all met here, they would withdraw my insurance. That's the kind of things that happen. When I went to court, I would sit on a pew, and all the people on the pew would get up and move. So you're just sitting there by yourself. That's the level of demonization that happened in 1979. And with that, I was driven to my knees. I understood myself as a good organizer. I had never contemplated anything like this happening. And I was now at the end of my rope. I grew up the grandson of a preacher who founded the church that I was a member of. He was born in slavery. He was not alive when I started the church. He just died a few. But I started to recover elements of my faith, and I started to grow spiritually. And I went to Virginia Union University School of Theology. And I tell you, those were the best 3 years in my life. I actually could now access a power, even though I knew Jesus, was able to talk a little bit about the Bible. I did not feel the power of the Spirit. So when I came back, the Klan was planning to march on Greensboro again. And I made a decision that I was going to find them and challenge them not to come. I asked my seminary professor of systematic theology, and he said, I wouldn't advise you to do that, you know. And so I asked the ethics professor. He said essentially the same thing. I talked to my pastor at Shiloh Baptist Church. He said, if that's what the Spirit is leading you to do, I'll support you in it. And my wife said the same thing. So I found the Grand Dragon, Carol Crawford, lived in Mount Ulla, North Carolina. I never heard of Mount Ulla, but it's right at the foothills of the mountains. And I called him. I went to Mount Ulla. I didn't tell him I was coming. And I had written just a note that quoted Matthew 5:43, which says, love your enemy and pray for those who despitefully use you, and so forth. And I asked a few people at an old country store, did they know where he was? They said, yeah, he's right down the road. So I went down there. There's a big sign saying, no niggas allowed. I didn't receive that as speaking to me. So I went on in, and he had a trailer. And I knocked on the door, nobody answered. I slid the note under the door. And I drove back to Greensboro and I called him. I had a number for him then. And when I said who he was just silent. And I said, I just been to your house. And then he broke out and started cursing and said, you haven't been to my GD house, et cetera, et cetera. I say, Carol, I've been to your house. You go to your back door and look under it, and there's a note from me. And I'm gonna call you back in 10 minutes. So I did. He said, you have been to my GD house. I said, yeah, I've been to your house. And I tried to say as serious as I can that this is not a show. I need to talk to you, you know? And he said, you crazy if you think I'm gonna drive to Greensboro for something y'all have set up to trap me. And I said, no, I'll come to you. You know, you just tell me where to come to, and I'll come to you. He gave me a time and a place. It was a service station off I-85 just outside of Salisbury. And in a few days, and we agreed on a time. In a few days, I started driving up there. And frankly, right outside of Greensboro, I just got scared. And I stopped, I pulled over, and I prayed. I didn't get unscared, but I had enough power to keep going. And so I went to the service station. There were 6 of them in a 2-seated pickup truck. And he got out in a Yankee hat. He told me he'd have a Yankee hat on and said, follow me. I thought he was going in the woods somewhere. But he went into Salisbury and to the Holiday Inn Hotel. And we went in a room. It was kind of a quad. I was sitting in, you know, it's kind of a U, 2 stories. I went in, it was the Grand Dragon and the previous Grand Dragon. And I sat in front of a window. That's where they directed me to sit, and they sit on both sides. And so I started to say, why are y'all coming to Greensboro, man? To spit on the graves of the people you killed. You can't believe that this is right. He said, we coming because y'all raped our women. And I said, listen to me. Do you think the rainbow of colors in the Black community came from Black men in slavery raping your women? You got to be out of your mind, you know? So I actually, he said, y'all took our jobs. And I said to you, give me one Black man who owns a textile mill. These jobs are going to Korea, Mexico, and different places because they can get cheap money over there. I mean, they can hire workers. Actually, there was a pause, and he said, you know, you have a point, but there's no way we can go back and tell the Klan that we sat down with an N person who's also a C person, and we agreed with him. And I was thinking, he said, we'd be thrown out of the Klan. This is the first time I felt I was talking to a human being. And I was thinking it's not a bad idea, but I didn't say it. I was just sitting there thinking. They said, this is what we're gonna do. We'll come to Greensboro, but we ain't gonna start now. We're gonna have our guns, but we ain't gonna start now. And so I pushed on him a little bit, and I said, do I have your word? He said, you got my word that we're gonna bring our guns and we're gonna march, but we're not gonna start now. Well, that happened. That was the beginning of the truth process for me. It's compelling myself to face a human being that actually had diametrically different views from mine and to create some connection thereof. We later envisioned a truth process, and we got a lot of help. We went down to Peru and met with the International Meeting of Truth Commissions. Bishop Tutu sent over one of the commissioners from South Africa, and he came over twice, and we fashioned a truth process that we took the city of Greensboro through. But the city refused to support. As a matter of fact, they voted not to support the truth process. This is 206. This happened in 79. We seeded the truth process in 2004. And they worked for 2 years and came out with a 529-page report, which we're still working with. Our city council still has not endorsed it, but they nibble around the edges of it. And I'll end with this. We're now in discussion with Philadelphia about them trying to do a truth process, and with a network of people out of Boston who are trying to develop a national truth process. And while I'm supportive of that, but unless there is a way to grow the moral and ethics, to grow the spirit in people, the truth processes will only take us a little ways. So I see the great challenge in our nation is how do we touch that piece of humanity that connects to the depth of spirit within people, that allow people to repent and grow into new possibilities. This is a short version. I know it didn't sound short, but it's 40 years since this happened. By the way, we had the 40th anniversary. I so much regret, Dr. Taylor, that you didn't get there. But about 600 people did come back to Greensboro. And we are still in discussion with each other. So thank you, beloved. Thank you, brothers and sisters, for giving me the opportunity to share these words.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. With the time that we have left, I just kind of want to have a little conversation and see if you would elaborate on a couple things. One of the things that you said that stood out, you talked about how you had to study white people, which when you said that, that just sounded so interesting based on context. It's like most of American context is studying white people. And so the fact that you just named that, but then you said I had to work my way out of some things. And so I want to connect those two statements and just ask you, as you see America and kind of the situations that we're in our history, what are some things that we really need to do as a nation to work our way out of? What do we need to do better? What are some things that are persistent that if we actually decided to work our way out of, we'd be much better for it?
I don't pretend to have profound answers to these questions, but I'm always willing to offer what I'm thinking. And frankly, I asked Dr. Taylor that question when he asked me to do this. And I said, do you see a pathway out of this? Because with the growth of narrowness and bitterness and anger building up, not just in our nation, but to some degree all over the world, where people are electing presidents and leaders who seem to live in a world of narrowness and hate. He said, and I'm agreeing with him, he said, I see a way. It's praying. And I want to join that. And I want us to connect that praying to creative actions that engages principalities and powers, and not nibble around the corners, but engage the heart of this system that has cultivated a depth of racism that they don't really understand. You know? They practice it and carry it out. And I think that's directly tied to some teaching, a lot of teaching that Jesus set forth. But the piece that occurs to me relates to economics. You said you can't serve two gods. You can't do it. You know, there's going to be loyalty ultimately to one, however much you fool yourself, and you're going to embrace that one at the expense of the other. If we can actually begin to get the growth in our prayer and spiritual life connected to how we understand material things, that's what kind of got me away from communism. Marx didn't go into his analysis of how capitalism developed. I think it's pretty much on time. But there was no way out for him because it didn't have a spiritual development component to it. Mm-hmm. I think on the local level and in groups like this, we have to commit ourselves to growing the spirit, growing the knowledge, growing the relationship, so that we can begin to be instruments that bend the moral arc of the nation toward a way forward. So that would be my reflections on that matter, knowing that so much more and much more profound is necessary.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. I want to bring up something when you were describing the story and you were talking about the incident at the restaurant with you and the Grand Wizard and the former Grand Wizard. Just hearing you talk about that obviously is profound. The fact that you were so comfortable to be there. And you were just, sitting with your back to the window. I can only imagine what was going through your mind. And it sounds like they probably had this all thought out and planned. But the fact that you were willing to be in that environment. But as you talked about it, one of the things that you mentioned was, or one of the things that became evident, that there was this misconception that they had of you and Black people about how it was affecting their life, that you were able to give them some truth to see something else. And so,
and by the way,
to a point. Oh,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I want to hear from you.
They asked me, why do you think you're sitting in front of this window? I was facing the window. If the window was in front of me, they were sitting one here and one there. I said, because this is the seat you offered me. That's all the answer I had, because they pointed to it. And they said, we've had a man across the street on the second floor who's had a bead on you ever since you've been sitting here. And if you made a move, that would have been the end of it. And I said, okay. At that point, I thought I was talking to the person because he opened that up. And it's a little later on that he said, you got a point, Then he used his group as the justification for not doing much more. Because his loyalty seemed to be, if I went back and told the members of the Klan that we were sitting and having this discussion with you and I agreed with you, we would be put out of the Klan. That's what he said. So in some sense, this group loyalty, this Southern thing, the way we have a certain portion of the population has attached itself to a false narrative around the Confederate flag and around many other things has to get undone. That the Confederate flag and the monuments are a false narrative themselves, because they ushered in a new form of slavery and the subjugation of people. And it's not just remembering history, it's actually redoing the same history. It's the same song, different verse. So I think this whole question of undoing certain parts of our history and trying to recover whatever there is good in our history, but never be confused with some of the stories that are being put out today.
I want to tap into that because that moment of agreement, it's really significant, and it was really powerful in how you explained it. There was this moment where he was like, I agree with you. You're right. But like you said, his loyalty wouldn't allow him to cross over. His loyalty wouldn't allow him to stop it. So how do we move beyond some of these loyalty things that we have so that we can actually deal with some reconciliation and unity? Because I think that what you described is part of what we're dealing with, is that there are people who know the truth. We want to do better, but we have these allegiances to other groups, to other things. And you mentioned it, and you talked about the Matthew 5, like you can't serve two masters piece. But is that kind of like the basis as you see it for America's actual issue? That we have dividing allegiance, and that prevents us from being able to actually come together?
It's a difficult question. You know, how does Ubuntu says that I am because you are? We kind of define ourselves in relationship to some particular group, you know, that we are inscribed in that group. And who we are is partly a derivative of that. I think the teaching of our faith is that how do you die to that and be born to something else? That's the challenge. You know, if you ask me what I would have done long time, it would have been trying to get them into a configuration of, if you agree with this, you know, you just said you don't have the power to actually act on it. How do you get power? You know, it's not just getting more and more people. This is where I think prayer actually comes in, you know, without a depthful kind of self-examination, without asking for God's help and the help of the Holy Spirit. It's hard to just leap out of your yesterday into a bright new tomorrow. You know, it doesn't quite happen that way. So I think that creating the atmosphere where that could happen. Now, when I came back to Greensboro, I was working with a white pastor who was progressive, and is Reverend Brady Faggot of the Lutheran Church. I sent him a letter and said that I have had this discussion with these Klan members. I don't think it's my calling to stay focused on this. And so I'm writing you and asking you, will you follow up? He got relocated, but he never got back to me. And after a while, I did feel that I needed to not spend all this time with Klans people, but to work with my own people. I was just getting ready to come out of seminary, becoming a new pastor, and so we've been building the Beloved Community Center. That's been the focus of our work. And I can't argue that walking away from the Klan members was necessarily the right thing to do. But the amount of work that it would take to follow that up would pretty much pull me away from what I thought was and is my calling. But I do think we need to get to that. I think that this period might be a period in which that is more open in terms of the number of our white brothers and sisters who are willing to look at something different. On the other hand, it's also a period in which those who are consumed by the ideology are locking down. So you got both of these things happening at the same time. But I think we got to work on both. I want white brothers and sisters to spend more time working with that strata of people. So those are just some of my rambling thoughts. Don't take them too serious.
No, thank you. Your rambling thoughts are better than some of my meditative thoughts, so I appreciate it. Thank you. thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your story. At this time, we're actually going to transition to our next presenters. I actually happen to be one of those, but myself and Dr. Janine Reese. So before we actually step into our presentation, I want to give Dr. Reese an opportunity just to introduce herself, tell you a little bit about herself as we get ready to step into this next element. And basically kind of our presentation is kind of going to walk through kind of in a dialogue format of looking at the infiltration of white supremacy in our policing. And we'll kind of walk through a historical aspect of this and then kind of bring it to current day. So Dr. Reese, if you wouldn't mind,
could I just
I'll
say,
give you an opportunity. Oh, yes, please.
Well, that much on the police, but it is totally drenched with white supremacy up until this present moment. But I wanted to throw a little broader than that, but I couldn't agree more that that is a necessary focus, particularly in this season. So thank you and thank the conference for focusing on that.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Well, Janine Reese here, and can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So here to partner with Josh in talking about, and Reverend Johnson said something very profound when he said that the problems that we're dealing with are worldwide. This is a unique, not a unique problem to the United States, but we live here, and so we must address it from this perspective. But Josh and I are going to look at 5 different articles that talk about infiltration of white supremacy in some of, especially our police departments and some other areas. And so, Josh, I'll toss it back to you. Janine Reese, Professor Emerita from ACU.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, I don't know if I fully introduced myself at the beginning, so I apologize for that. I'm actually Joshua Jackson. I'm the lead minister at the Rural Hill Church of Christ in Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm grateful just to be doing this work with Dr. Taylor and all the different conversations that we get to have around the spiritual work that's necessary to bring about racial reconciliation, racial unity. So with that, the first article we're going to address is a piece that was done by the New York Times that was published in July of this year. Published originally July 3rd, updated 2 days later, July 5th. But basically it talks about the fundamental starting place for even Nazi Germany and the police understanding and how they built that off of the American system of how racism functioned. And so one of the things that was really profound in this very first article that we're going to look at, called it As a Neo-Nazi Seed, Military Ranks, Germany Confronts an Enemy Within. And so in this German organization, the KSK, which is basically their Navy SEALs equivalent, there became this motivation for people to join this group who have been radicalized, who wanted to see white people in a more dominant way. And one of the things that really stands out in this article is that kind of something that Dr. Johnson was talking about is that they had this narrative that these immigrants who had been coming over were the problem, that it wasn't so much that they hated everybody else, they just felt like they were losing something. That they were missing out on something. And so with that being said, like, Dr. Reese, like, how do you see like just that same sympathy, that same mentality kind of in our context in our world today?
Well, isn't it part of why we fear the immigration problem we have on our borders? That we're so afraid that something's going to happen that's going to forever change the way we have known life, which is, by the way, as right now we've talked about white privilege, and there's a lot of conversations about the browning of the United States, and that by, I think it's 2045, that the white race will no longer be the majority. But I think another piece that's really profound, so yes, it's on our borders, and yes, it comes from other nations, but the same kind of fear that was present there, I think is present here.
Mm. Yeah, and so in the article, it talks about how these individuals, they sought out this power. They wanted to be a part of this group, this special elite tactical force, and they were getting to stockpile weapons. They were learning how to make explosives, and they're just now figuring this out, that this has been going on for years. But something happened recently that has accelerated the number of people who are trying to join this group, and they're wrestling through how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that being said, from this piece, one of the things that was really interesting is that it's easy, to kind of look at America and say, we have this issue, but like Dr. Johnson said, like Dr. Reese pointed out, we're not the only ones dealing with this sort of thinking, this sort of mentality. And I think there are two critical things that we are going to use for like the foundation of the rest of these articles that shows up in this one. And I think they help shape how we see policing in America, is that one, there's this sentiment of self-preservation that is evident in how they see things, that if these things continue, like Dr. Reese was saying, it won't be what we always knew. We're going to lose something. So that aspect is definitely present. But then there's this, and I appreciate Dr. Reese saying this when we had our conversation earlier, this gullibility. And so I want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk more about that, what that looks like and what that means, because as we go through the rest of these articles, I think you're going to see how that plays into it.
Well, one of the things, there's a particular paragraph in this article. It says Germany has a problem. And then it says that for years, security officers and politicians rejected the notion of far-right infiltration of the security services. They thought it was only about individual cases. And I have heard that argument over and over again, that you see, and people give you labels if you think a certain way, that you see something that I don't see. You see a conspiracy, you see a systematic problem. I just think these are isolated incidents that people are threading together. But in Germany, they're waking up to the reality, because they've found that military materials and bombs and other things are being stolen and buried. They found that some of the Nazi memorabilia was being buried. And so I think this is, well, let me just say it this way. We know from history that this is a possibility anywhere. We want to look at Germany and just say that, well, Germany has a problem and that's their problem, but they had a problem years ago, and Western Germany did a good job of owning theirs. They don't hide their history. They talk about the Holocaust and they talk about what they did, and they make it clear that they don't want this to ever happen again. So if I were living in Germany right now, I would find this very frightening. But this is not here to point out the dangers of Germany. What you were mentioning that I said earlier is, yes, I am concerned about those people who are by nature going to support white supremacy. But I'm equally concerned about the people who are gullible to those ideas. How was it that for so many years, churches in Germany in the 1930s and 40s simply ignored what was going on? And isn't that also true in United States churches during slavery and even in the civil rights movement, where churches and Christians should have been on the front lines? We were silent. We said nothing and we did nothing. And I think that kind of gullibility to bury our head in the sand, to close our eyes to the problems, to convince ourselves that this is only somebody else's problem, is perhaps as dangerous as white supremacy itself.
Wow. No, thank you for that. So bringing that to the United States, one of the things that we looked at, the social media aspect of this. And in some ways, it's like an obvious, aha moment. I mean, we remember what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. You begin to see the pictures of these Nazi sympathizers, these right-wing individuals. But the text that we looked at, one of the articles, it's almost like they're not even afraid. Like they're very bold in what they're willing to post and what they're willing to share about their views in terms of these individuals who are law enforcement. And so one of the statements that was in there was a study done, and it talks about how 1 in 5, that the cops that they looked at in these precincts, it was a ratio of 1 in 5 had posted something that was deemed as being racist, or that was being, something that was offensive to another racial group. And it was like, but it wasn't like they had to go searching, digging around for it. They were public about it. They would make offensive memes, or they would retweet something, or they would recopy something somewhere on Facebook. And so what it says is, and that you're thinking that these are just, beat cops on the streets, but these are actually some of their their leadership. These are people in higher positions within police departments who are equally contributing to this. And so with that understanding, like, what do we do about this? Or where is a good starting place for this?
Well, and I think as we look towards solutions a little bit later in their meeting today, I hope this is one of the things that we will address. Because in all honesty, I don't even know if we've ever had any way of policing the police. We trusted they would police themselves. But as Reverend Johnson was talking, it was clear that they weren't. And so this is going to take some radical work, and it's going to be challenging, I think, really challenging. And by the way, sometimes, as I said earlier, there's a gullibility that this is a problem somewhere else. This is not from our police department. In fact, I trust that our police department in Abilene will investigate it thoroughly. But I don't think I even told you, Josh, that recently, I think 2 days ago, there was a swastika and the N-word painted on the side of a business here in Abilene. So it is everywhere. And so we've got to be careful, but our focus is on what's going on in leadership and in police. Apparently the military, and one of our other articles we'll talk about, did some reform because they realized that they were having a lot of the same kind of thing going on. And they've done some reform, but it still needs to be looked at. So how do we do it from the top? I don't think it can come from the top down. I think it has to come from the citizenship. It has to come from the community itself. Until the community will rise up and address these things and be specific in our request, then I do not think that it's possible for anything to happen. You can go look this article up on the Abilene Reporter News. I don't even remember what year it was, but Doug Foster, who's going to be a speaker next, and Jerry Taylor and I and some others petitioned to not allow the Ku Klux Klan to have a parade on Martin Luther King holiday here in Abilene. And so citizens can rise up and take action. And yes, there was some pushback on that. People thought that was ridiculous. They didn't think it was a good idea. They thought we were overreacting, but the Klan didn't get to come in. And so I believe it has to start at community roots. And I think I'm going to be very careful how I say this because I am a white person. I think that's fairly obvious. But I think there is a huge white responsibility to address these issues. For far too long, we've made it the responsibility of our Black brothers and sisters, our brown brothers and sisters. And I just can't imagine how exhausted they must be constantly in having to address these issues and be concerned about how they're treated and the racism that is systemic in our nation. I can't imagine how fatiguing that is. So I believe it's communal, and I believe whites need to join with our African-American, Hispanic, Latina, and other groups to address this from a communal standpoint.
No, thank you. Thank you for saying it. Thank you for your transparency. And the article that you mentioned, this was one of the ones, the one by The Guardian. And for those of you, if you saw the outline for today, you see the links for all the articles. But this is one of the articles I would definitely encourage everybody to look at. It's not that long, but one of the things that's so interesting about this article is that it almost seems unreal. And it's not that I was naive to what Dr. Johnson was saying about the infiltration of white supremacists in police departments, but this particular article lays out, there's an individual named Joshua Dugwell, and he is in Anniston, Alabama. He's part of he was a part of the police department. He is no longer there. He has since been terminated. But even on his application, he listed that he was a member of the League of the South, which has been identified as an anti-Semitic and a racial hate group. Like they do interviews with members at the police precinct. They're asking the police chief, and they're like, yeah, we all knew. He even had recruited other individuals that he worked with. And nobody is concerned. It's like, it's just business as usual. And so the fact that he was going to these rallies, he was becoming a leader in these rallies, he'd been promoted twice in the police precinct right there in Anniston. And it says that in Anniston, the population of African Americans or Black people is nearly 50% of the population. There are 2 council members that are Black, 3 that are white. You need a majority to make any changes. So the whites obviously held the majority in this precinct, in this area. But the way that this article talks through it, and even this individual, one of the statements that he makes, and it was probably the thing that stood out to me the most, And I'm going to read it because I want to quote it correctly. It says, he couched his extremism views in careful terms. He often centered his religious beliefs, and that was the key word for me, his religious beliefs. He wasn't against blacks, he claimed. He just didn't believe God had created the races to be mixed. These are his religious beliefs. And so is there something about our view of God or the differences in how we see God that is a problem, or that is creating, or that is exacerbating this issue? Is there something about how we have framed God, put God in certain images, that has made this a problem, or that has created more of a problem?
I don't know if we associate it with God as much as we do with the church. I think we would have a very hard time theologically defending this. But you and I were talking earlier, and part of what's said in that same article is the fear. Let's see if I can find my notes. It says the fear that white Southern culture is in danger of extinction, concerned about religious pluralism, homosexuality, and interracial couples. And so it in the name of faith and Christianity, and we can see this in our political scene right now. People are making claims in Christianity that I don't know that they have any basis in Christianity. And that's what's scary. But it's almost as if this fear of extinction is very, so I see a lot of fear in here. You know, I think I'm going apart from what you're saying, but I think it's really important I don't know that I see it so much associated with God, except I find even among some of my students of color in the classroom at ACU, surprised that God's not white. Mm. And I want to say never was, never will be, not a God above that. But Jesus comes on earth, he's certainly not a white man. He's a man of color. And so I think, however, that the way we have written the story, the way we have portrayed Jesus, the way that we talk in Sunday school, especially in our white churches, I think this creates a whole tension. But the fact that we can do anything in the name of God, in the name of Christianity, and see it as justified, to me, that's one of the greatest dangers of what's going on. But it's not so much fear that Christianity won't be what they think it will be. I think Christianity has gotten messed up with culture and mixed up with politics and mixed up with ideologies that have no place in a Christian life.
Yeah, so I remember we were talking earlier, and I said this. So I'm born and raised Wichita, Kansas, and it's not perfect by any means. And, so let me not couch it that way, but something was different about being in the Midwest in terms of how we talked about religion and politics. And basically the understanding was never shall the two meet. You can have your political thoughts, you can have your religious thoughts, but we don't combine those. And then God had it in his plan for me to do my undergrad work at Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas, where I got a rude awakening or a realization that God, football, and politics is all one conversation. So you get the right Jesus, the right team, which was the Dallas Cowboys there, and being a Republican, that was all one conversation. And I don't mean that jokingly, it was just, that's all one conversation. And they work fluidly into each other.
Yeah, and that's one conversation with certain people.
Correct.
That's not
exactly.
true with everyone.
That's not true with everyone. That's right.
Well, I say that not to be defensive, but just simply to say that I'm not denying anything that you're saying. I agree with you. But to say that when you do not follow that, then you're vilified.
Correct. And
that's
and
the
even
hardest part.
if you're not comfortable, or if you're not even cultured into doing that, there's a difference.
Yeah.
But I think what was so unique was watching it happen. Because the first couple of times I'm listening to people talk about it, and I'm trying to enter the conversation. I don't know where to enter, because it's like, I don't know what are we talking about? I'm lost. Yeah. And I learned a little bit more after moving to Atlanta and seeing certain things, and then being in North Florida with certain things. But there was this mixing of all three, or at least in the politics and the religious space. that I think, like you're saying, that we're going to have to figure out a way how to separate those again.
Mhm. Well, one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the Guardian article, again, this one individual specifically is outed. And you mentioned that he was promoted. Brian Levin, who is a former New York Police Department officer, but now directs the Center for Study of Hate and Extermination, and he does this in California. He acknowledges that there's a lot of white supremacy in our police departments and probably in other leadership areas. And he said it's not that all of these white supremacists are necessarily violent. And I think this is an important thing to know, because I thought the fact that he said that when he was working in the Center for Study of Hate and Extremism, but what he said is, even if it's not violent, it's like a ticking bomb in our departments, that it wouldn't take much for something to be set off. And so I think it's really easy sometimes to assume that every white supremacist is violent. And I think Levin is saying not necessarily, but we do have to be aware of the potential for damage and danger.
So another one of those things that was really important about that article was that you have all this information about this cop who's a part of this racial hate group against the backdrop of what happens there in 1961.
Yes.
With the bus transit thing, right? So you have these freedom riders who are then abused, who are taken advantage of, who have this incident where the police precinct is less than a block away. Their tires are on their bus are smashed out, right? They're basically terrorized a block away from the police precinct, and the police do nothing. They show up later that evening in this very same town of Anniston. And so there's a place where something with, like Dr. Johnson was saying at the end, about there's this history of Blacks feeling terrorized because of what happened in the town. And then for you to have a police officer who not only is working the streets, but then is promoted, who has a background such as this, who's targeting certain race groups, or who believes certain race groups are inferior. Like, I can only imagine what that does to the trauma for Blacks in that society, who are trying to make a change and who recognize they don't have the voice to do better because they don't have the majority in the city council. Even though they're majority in terms of people, they don't have the power to do anything else, which I think is a key word that Dr. Johnson brought up, because that power thing is very important. Because just because you're the majority doesn't mean you have the power to make change or to affect change.
Well, one of the things that I also thought was really interesting, because when going back to the Facebook article we talked about, the second one, where these people were sending these texts out and posting on Facebook, etc. And one of the things I want to be careful about as we talk about this is I would rather they speak it and expose it than not. Because I do think that the greater danger is if and when some of this hatred and this vilification of the races and this white supremacy goes more underground. And I do think there's a lot of it that's underground. But, you know, the argument that's given, and I think that the gentleman that's referenced in this article that you talked about earlier, he won a case, if I remember correctly, on the basis of he had free speech, that I have the right to speak. Another person, I think this comes from, and I can't remember, say I'm saying the name right, Sherag Baines is a former senior counsel of the lead of Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division, said there are limitations on what government employees can do, especially with where their speech implicates their ability to do their jobs properly. And so I felt a tension in this, in that I want us to do a job of finding out what people believe and what they're posting and what organizations they belong to. But I also want to be careful that we don't encourage that to go further underground where we will not know. And so I think finding that balance is going to be a bit challenging for those who are looking at the police departments or military or whomever to weed out bad influences.
And so I think that brings us to a really critical question, like, because it brings up this, what happens in the next article with the FBI and their research in this. So one of the things that, you know, was constantly kind of teased out in that article was, so what do we do about this? What do we do about this? Only for the writer later to kind of let you know it's a lot harder to deal with than we imagine. So because of our free speech laws, which I'm very much in favor of, I'm thankful for the First Amendment and those things, But what they lay out is that in other countries that have free speech laws, hate speech and hate rhetoric is not allowed in those freedom of speech. And so just because you're a part of a group that sympathizes with something here in America, we're not able necessarily to do anything until you commit an act.
Mhm.
So in police precincts, this is really difficult because you can have people who are racist at all different levels, whether explicit or implicit. But until they commit some act or until there is some level of violence committed, just because they feel a certain way, they hold certain beliefs, they hold certain thoughts and ideologies, that does not necessarily criminalize them from the beginning. And so, unlike the military, which is one of the pieces that they distinguish, the military, if you hold these types of views, because they're a government agency, they are able to do something about it on a much quicker front, to the point that they can almost try to alienate it. You are subject to the rest of this institution. They check for tattoos, they checking what's going on. Whereas when the FBI is doing this, they know these individuals, they've targeted them, they're watching them, they're monitoring them, but they cannot do anything to them. And part of it, they said, is because there's so many individual precincts that kind of have their own ways of doing things. And I thought it was kind of unique that it talks about how when they were asking, are you even checking on your officers, what they post on social media? And you had these police chiefs and others who were like, no, we really don't monitor it. Unless we get a complaint about them doing their job, what they do is kind of on their own. Even if we know that they're involved in these other, groups and these people who want to see, violence committed against other races, until they do, or unless it affects job performance, as it was in the case that we were talking about in this last article, what the police chief said, that even though Joshua was a part of this group, it didn't affect his job. So what do we have a reason to do anything for? That's why he was promoted. He was a good cop who held racist ideologies, but he never acted on those that affected his job performance.
Well, and you and I talked about the challenge that, and I explained, having been previously married to my first husband who was killed in an accident, was a Marine, and he would talk about the importance of camaraderie and having each other's back when you were in war, and that made a lot of sense to me. And so we hear a lot as civilians about the blue wall, about the protection, and I can only imagine that that's an important element, and yet I also think it's a dangerous element. And so it's got to be something that's going to be addressed at some level, because this same article talks about, in fact, I think it was 2006, wasn't it, that the FBI warned of the infiltration of the police departments and others of white supremacist groups. But this same article talks about what they call ghost skins, those that they encourage to become white supremacists, but that they keep it hidden. And that's what I was saying earlier, that frightens me, that I want to expose it on one hand, I do, and yet I know that by exposing it, we will also encourage even more of this. And I think it was 2015 that Comey, the FBI director, acknowledged the role that the police departments have played historically in our world, and he says it wasn't pretty. And is it this article that talks about the origins of the police departments?
Well, no, that's the next one. That's
okay,
the next.
Sorry.
So, but one of the things this article does mention is that how that was, well, so they actually were talking about how these white supremacist groups, KKK and others, they're actively targeting former military individuals and people who are going into, or they're trying to encourage their members to join police forces. And so there's this militarization mentality that they're trying to create. And the article that we talked about earlier with the gentleman who was a part of the police system in Anniston, Alabama, one of the things that was mentioned by one of the other people who were part of that group is that there was a comment saying that he was looking to finish what the South didn't do. Mm-hmm. And that statement just kind of stood out to me. Like, there's this mentality of Southern ideology, of Southern culture, and for some reason there's this extermination of other races that goes with that, or the subjugation of other races that coincide with that, at least in their view. And I don't think, like I said, I don't think all white people hold those views, but when they were speaking, it was, this is what we're looking to do. We're trying to preserve ourselves, which means that we need to eliminate or eradicate others. And at the same time, we believe this is fundamentally the work of God for us.
Yeah. I don't think we need to, I think we need to recognize that this is very organized and
Very
very
so.
purposeful. It is not random. In fact, it was in 2009 that after Obama was elected that the Department of Homeland Security saw the resurgence of right-wing extremism and basically said that this is a greater threat. Domestic terrorism from such groups is a greater threat than foreign terrorism. And we just don't think about that. And so I think it's really important because when we talk about foreign terrorism or when we talk about 9/11 and people coming into the country, and this has been one of the arguments against immigration in the United States, but when we recognize that the greater threat is actually domestic, then that ought to give us real pause. And that ought to be the kind of thing that causes our communities to come together and insist that these issues be addressed. But as you talked a moment ago about the military doing some reform, and yet the police departments or these white supremacists often are recruiting from the military. I think that one of the biggest challenges we're going to face as we look at possible police reform is that it depends on it's locally based. It's the government principalities and municipalities in every situation. And how can we? So I think you asked me, I think you asked me earlier, was I promoting federal control? And I don't know how to answer that. That's really a challenge for me. But at the same time, I think there's got to be a federal accountability if there's not control. And I don't think we have that.
So let's look at this last article, which kind of gives us the solutions, but goes into so much depth in terms of the history of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to bring up 2 points in this, and I think this can help us in terms of this discussion and even for what we're going to have them do in their breakouts. But one of the statistics that are given in that abstract portion, it says that a third of Americans basically had an unfavorable view of police in America. So a third of them. But when you break that into just African Americans, that number is 60%. So you get that. And then it talked about the history where in many of these smaller areas, the way that policing kind of started was back during slavery, where they went to go catch, it was this self-appointed militia group that went to go recapture runaway slaves. They were holding an institution in place. And then it talks about how there was this almost state sanctioned or state licensed or state accepted brutality of Black and brown bodies, where police would kind of turn a blind eye to them abusing Black people. Even post-civil rights, post-civil war, post-civil rights, both. But it's just, okay, so if this is happening, if this is going on, then it brings up the question and kind of how you see things today when Blacks are just, there's this inherent fear of police. Whether it's justified completely in every situation or not, I don't know, and I'm not saying all Black people are afraid of the police, because not all Black people are, obviously. But I think most of us have been trained, or we have been taught, that you engage with police with a certain way. You don't just take it for granted.
You know, I've got several things I want to say about that. One is The Cross and the Lynching Tree by Cone was one of the most convicting books I've ever read. Disturbing, talking about the common experience of lynchings of Black men. I think equally challenging, and Reverend Johnson referenced the notion that Black men were raping white women. That myth was so permeating. But I asked you, well, I basically asked you several questions. I said, did you watch Mr. Rogers growing up? And you said no. And Mr. Rogers, you know, there's been the recent movie out on his life, In the Neighborhood, or I can't remember exactly. And it's a good movie. But one of the programs that he had, I remember my children watching it, and it was like, who are the helpers? And it showed the policemen and the firemen and the postmen. And I asked you, did you ever see that kind of thing in your growing up? And what was your answer? No. And so that's one thing I want to say. The second one I asked you about, because in white culture, when I say I'm going to have the talk with my children, I'm talking about what we often call the birds and the bees, which I admitted to you, I never understood why we called it that, because that's not how birds and bees operate. But what's the talk in Black families?
The talk is how to survive in terms of law enforcement. And I remember, well, there were two different situations for me where the talk came up. So there was the formal one, and then there was the first one that was informal. And my informal one, I think I was like 6 or 7. We had went into the gas station. My parents were getting gas, and I had gone into the store with my mom, and I had like $1 and some change, you know, and I love Laffy Taffies. You know, you can get them for like 5 cents, and so you can get like 20 of them, you know, for $1. So here I am getting all my Laffy Taffies. I only like the red and the pink ones. So I'm going through like the little bin, you know, they used to have them. You just pick out all the ones you want. So I have them in my hand. I put them up on the counter, and I'm paying for them. And, you know, and they were like, okay. And so I'm scooping them off back into my hand. I paid for them. My mom was like, you get a bag for that.
Yeah.
And you get a receipt for that. And at the time it was like, well, everybody's watched me pay for them. The clerk hasn't said anything. And my mom was like, she was irate that I just didn't think to say, yes, I want a bag and a receipt for this. And it was just like, okay, so didn't think much of it. But that conditioning did something to me. Like, I remember just, it took me probably about 4 years ago when I stopped getting gas at the pay at the pump. Like, I still kept receipts. I would just have receipts lying. My wife was like, why do you have all these random receipts? Because I had just been trained. I get a receipt in the bag for everything, like always. But then also when I started driving, my dad had the conversation with me, and he said, look, and I remember just how it went. He said, I know you go to a school where there's a lot of white kids. You can't do what they do, and you can't be where they can be. And so if ever you feel that you might be in a place that's uncomfortable or that it might be a challenge for you, you need to drive yourself. And you don't let anybody else in the car without asking them some questions. You need to know who's riding with you at all times, and don't ever be anywhere that you can't get yourself out of on your own. Don't depend on anybody else to get you out of. And he says, and now look, if you happen to get stopped, first thing you need to do is you turn on your hazard lights to acknowledge that the cops have, you know, flagged you down. Don't you pull over in the middle of nowhere. You slow down, you drive to somewhere where there's lights, whether it's a gas. He's like, I don't care if you have to drive another 100 miles. You slow down, but you keep going until you get to where there's other people. Don't just be pulling over in the middle of nowhere. Then you go ahead and get your ID out, get the insurance card out, you put it on the dash, and you roll the window down, and you keep your hands on that wheel, turn the music down, don't reach for anything.
Right.
And I mean, this is, and he's looking at me completely serious. He was like, and I'm not playing. He was like, don't mess around thinking something's wrong and you get shot.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, at 15, I didn't believe I needed to hear that, but then come to find out, a lot of my other white friends, they was like, nah, nobody ever told me that.
Right. Right.
But that's the conversation I got when I started driving.
Well, see, and I've had students tell me, Black students, that they were told by their parents, don't walk in with your hands in your pocket.
Yep.
But I said to a student 2 years ago, a young Black man in my class who's always wearing a hoodie. And I said, you've got to quit wearing that hoodie. And he said, but my head's cold. I said, yeah, but that's sending a message. I'm sorry that it is. And I don't want people to target you. And he said, yeah, my mom said the same thing. Because, you know, it's bothering me. But here's a piece I also have thought about in terms of this particular article. And I want to ask you some more questions in a moment. But one of the defenses I hear from white people when I'm talking about these issues is what they will say to me is, until you get Black on Black crime taken care of, you have no right to address this. Well, it's dawned on me in reading these articles that if African-American folks or brown people as well, or others, are afraid to call the police, that makes them greater targets for crime from other people, whether they're white or Black. And I've thought about that. I mean, I know we see that we've seen all these high profile cases of young men and women being killed by the police in recent months and weeks. But that part really stuck to me. And I've often argued against that argument, but it dawned on me, but if all that we're saying is true, and these articles are supporting that there's this white supremacy here, and 60%, as you said, of Black folks are afraid to call the police, it's surprising that there's more crime in those areas. But one of the things I did like about this article, Josh, I think you did too, is that it begins to point us in the direction of some solutions, which I know is where we're going to end our meeting today. But talk to me about one of the things they brought up that I had not heard about was Brady. What is Brady?
So they talk about this. Well, it's what's called, it was Brady versus Maryland, which was this legislative piece. But it requires that the prosecution turn over all evidence to the defense of a case, especially when it comes to things in government proceedings. And so they talk about how this hasn't been enforced very well in terms of policing, where there are certain records that are hidden or certain information that's kept unavailable when they're doing these trials for these police officers, or they're precinct by precinct. So if an officer gets in trouble at one precinct, that information isn't willingly given to the next precinct when they're going. And so one of the things the author recommends, he says that we really have to take Brady to the fullest. We need this information to not only be public, but they need to be handing over all aspects of behavioral and conduct mishaps when they're actually doing these reviews on these officers, or when they're actually prosecuting these officers, so that you know everything that's going on. And it's not just, we want to give you what we want you to have. And so he says that if we start doing that, that we can eliminate some of these issues, and we can keep some of these cops, basically, he said, from getting fired at one place and going to the next, or in some cases, keep them from even just being able to keep their job based on unions and other things that hold them in power. He says, you'll actually have some evidence to say, well, based on this litany of things, that this is an open and shut case. This person does not need to be serving in this role.
Well, one of the things that I think we need to really be able to hone in on here is we're advocating the reform of police departments. I think sometimes when we say those words, some people hear destroy police departments. I don't think that's the intention at all. I think the intention of reformation has a completely different meaning. So what are some steps that this article proposes for us to reform police departments?
So one of the things that I think is critical that it lays out as a problem is that statistic. I think there's just a distrust between communities of color and police officers. And I can admit that, even though I know a lot of good policemen, like I even have some of my family, but I know a lot of them being in ministry, even at my churches. I have police officers and retired police officers, white, black, and Hispanic, right here in my congregation. And I think they're all good people. And so it's hard to label everything with the broad brush, especially when you're talking about individuals that you know. But I think that we have to find a way to increase that morale so that communities of color don't feel, they don't have to think twice about calling the police, that they're feeling like they're going to be the subject of the issue if they're calling about somebody else's bad behavior or if they see a crime. I said this to one of my white ministry friends a couple weeks ago when they asked me about Ahmaud Arbery. I said, I have never in my mind considered doing a citizen's arrest. Like, just never thought of even to do that. And even as a black person in America, like, I think twice about calling the police. And I know I shouldn't, but I've just been conditioned that way. Like, if I see a crime, more often than not, I'm probably just gonna pretend I didn't see anything and walk away, because I'm thinking if I call the cops, they might come looking for me. And I don't have anything to be afraid of, which I know that, but I don't know, something tells me that that might not be all that there is to this. And so I think we have to find a way to build those relationships and reestablish those relationships. But looking at the history of policing, I don't think it's surprising that that's not there. So I think that's one thing that the article says we really have to do. But then I think that the other piece of this is that we have to find a way to not only identify those who are infiltrated our police systems, who are on the negative, who are bad, but we have to find a way of rooting that out. That really deals and addresses that, because those individuals who do hold racist ideologies, who do hold anti-Semitic values, they're putting a shadow, they're casting a shadow over the other ones, whether they want to or not.
Right.
So for all the good ones who are doing the right thing, it's the few bad ones that happen to be the narrative that the other ones then have to try to defend against.
Right.
So if we do a better job of basically qualifying officers and going through a rigorous process, we look for the implicit and explicit biases they have, finding different ways of testing for that to help cut that off at the beginning, then we can do a better job in terms of our policing in communities of color.
Well, and I mentioned to you, and I think I've referenced this earlier, but I want to test not only for those who have white supremacist views and racial biases. I want to test for those who are gullible to being influenced by it. Because part of what's going on right now is there are people, I'm convinced, that are not necessarily part of one of these hate groups who are most easily influenced. They're just very, very easily influenced people. So there are personality tests that can be done. And so that's one of the things I think is really going to be important. But when we talk about reform, you've mentioned two pieces I just want to highlight, as I know we're getting close to done. Yes, we need to reform the police departments, but we also have to find a way to build community trust. And those go hand in hand, and one cannot happen without the other. If we reform the police departments, but we do nothing to build communal trust, it won't make any difference. And so that's going to be a lot of hard work. And I'm looking forward to hearing what some of the solutions that come up. I recently showed in a leadership class that I taught at ACU the movie Invictus. And one of the most powerful moments for me is when Mandela insists that the soccer team go and teach the young children in the ghetto how to play soccer and the difference that that makes. And so we're going to have to get real creative to think about what we can do, because I don't think it's going to be a white soccer team that's going into the ghetto in the United States, but there has to be some ways that trust can be rebuilt and the reformation can occur on both of these levels.
So true. Yes. Thank you for that. So actually, before we go into our next piece, I want us to take a moment. So we're going to take a short break till about, we'll take like a 5-minute break. So we'll come back at 4:53. But what I want to do, I want you to actually do in that time, obviously go to the bathroom, whatever else you have to do to be prepared. But I want you to begin thinking about these solutions, because during our breakout sessions, that's what we're going to ask you to bring to the table. But we're not just asking you to bring solutions in terms of what's off the top of your head. We need these to be spiritual based solutions because this is the work of the church. This is the work of those who follow Christ. And so during this time, I want you to take a break. We'll come back at 4:53 and we'll have our next presenters. But during that time, like I said, just be prayerful and start thinking about what are some spirit-based solutions to help us move forward. Dr. Reese, thank you so much.
Sir, you were wonderful. Thank you. I think I've taken my, I'm talking, but you can't see me, so I'm going to run to the restroom.
So we're muted. We're muted to everybody else.
All right, we are back. All right, so our next presenters, Dr. Doug Foster and Darren Haygood. I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to introduce yourselves at the beginning of your presentation, and then at the same time, you guys can go straight into your talk. So I'll turn it over to the two of you at this time.
So my name is Darren Haygood. I'm the minister at Long Beach Church of Christ out in California. I did a lot of work with Dr. Taylor in the racial unity leadership summits over the past few years. I got my undergrad at ACU as well as my master's there, along with my wife. And we're very passionate about this work and just excited to be here and grateful for Doc and all the things that he continues to do to unify people and help us to address these difficult things in America. But I'll hand it over to Dr. Foster because he's gonna get us started.
Thanks so much, Darren. I'm Doug Foster. Please make sure I'm not muted. I'm Doug Foster. I'm scholar in residence, I guess you'd say, at Abilene Christian University, church historian. I've worked with Jerry quite a bit in the Racial Unity Leadership Summits and in the Spain Center in recent years. It's a pleasure to be part of this. I'm not sure, am I showing on the video? Okay. I'm going to talk just for a minute about this book, Hitler's American Model, The United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law. I guess in some ways, the material in the book, in a general way, might not be surprising to anyone who knows much about American race law and American racism. The history of American racism has been told, the whole idea of white supremacy has been told in a lot of places in recent years and in different aspects of it over the years. The most recent sort of comprehensive study by Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning, is, I think, one of the most comprehensive and well-written books that goes into great detail on sort of the history of the way America has been shaped by white supremacy and continues to be. And so what this book does, it's an extremely well-written book, and it's heavily documented. The author is a person who has gone in extensive research into the German documents themselves, many of which talk extensively about American race law. And he documents how the chief German legal authorities of the Nazi regime in the 1930s drew extensively from America's race law to formulate their own laws and policies. There were three stages, I guess you'd say, historically, in how those laws came about. That is the creation of Nazi race laws. It started way before this, but as far as documents are concerned, the first was the so-called Prussian Memorandum of 1933, where radical Nazi legal theorists began to try to explain what they believed had to be done to preserve the purity, so to speak, of the German race. The second stage is a strategy meeting that was held by Nazi lawyers in June 1934 that led to the following year in September 1935, what I would call the triumph of Nazi race policy in the promulgation of the Nuremberg laws. Now, at every stage, Whitman, the author of this book, documents how Nazi legal strategists looked at, quoted from American US models from which to draw ideas and inspiration for their own legislation. This Whitman's book that came out only a couple of years ago was actually kind of a bombshell in the historical community, because a lot of people, historians and others, had been saying for years that the Nazis did not draw on American law, that there are some similarities here and there, but that they didn't draw from American race law to form their ideas. Even some conservative German lawyers in the time that these laws were being promulgated argued that the United States, because it didn't specifically target Jews in their legislation, it wasn't really of much help to what they were trying to do in the Nazi regime. But Whitman thoroughly dispels that notion through extensive quotations, again, from the Nazi transcripts of meetings and legal opinions and articles written by German lawyers, all during this period in the early 20th century. One thing that Whitman is not claiming, he's not claiming two or three things. He's not claiming that the Nazis just simply copied American race laws. He's not claiming that they were unambiguously favorable toward the American legal, political, and constitutional system. They were not, although they saw a lot of things that they really liked about the potential, at least, of the American system. And he certainly doesn't claim that Nazism originated in the United States. But what he does claim, which to me is perhaps even more chilling and uncomfortable, is something that I want to try to show as we look at the material over the next 10 or 15 minutes, and then come to the conclusion that he makes. So let me just sort of go through some of the data for a few minutes, and then we'll get to that conclusion. Of course, there are numerous precedents to the time period that we're talking about, the 20s and 30s of the 20th century, that firmly established the principle of white supremacy. And white supremacy is a terminology that corresponds, it's the functional equivalent to the Nazi term master race. And there are lots of precedents to this period that we're looking at now in this 1920s and 1930s that have to do with white supremacy. In the colonial period, for example, laws forbidding white persons from marrying non-whites were on the books as early as 1691 in Virginia. The first naturalization law passed by the US Congress in 1790 admitted, quote, only free white persons as citizens. The US Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857, again, is most legal scholars would say it's an awful decision, but what's most important about the Dred Scott decision is not that it made the claim basically doing away with the concept of free states, but what it most importantly articulated was the white supremacist doctrine that was present, has been present from the beginning in the American legal system, mentality. And so I'll just quote briefly from part of that Dred Scott decision. The men who framed the Declaration of Independence were great men, high in literary acquirements, high in their sense of honor. They perfectly understood the meaning of the language they used, that is, all men are created equal, and how it would be understood by others. And they knew that it would not in any part of the civilized world be supposed to embrace the Negro race. What I'm trying to say here is that what the Nazis were looking at as far as the race laws that they drew inspiration and ideas from in the early 20th century, has been present in various ways from the very beginning of this nation. They actually saw what happened in the Civil War, or after the Civil War, I should say, with the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments that abolished the institution of slavery, except for incarceration for a crime, and made citizens of all persons born in the United States. They actually saw those so-called Reconstruction Amendments as aberrations that pitted the ideology of white supremacy, which they embraced and thought was great about the American way of doing things. But they saw those things pitting the ideology of white supremacy against what the Nazis regarded as the ridiculous notion that everyone who bears a human countenance is equal. So what the Nazi legal experts were most intrigued by was how US law was still able to continue being a pioneer in the creation of racist laws and institutions despite the constitutional law of an egalitarian order. They were intrigued by, even though those pieces of the Constitution were there, the white Americans were able still to circumvent those with these racial laws. As early as his second volume of Mein Kampf in the late 1920s, Hitler was talking about, this is one of those precedents for Nazi law, he was talking about what he believed would be the right way to define citizenship, a full citizen of Germany. And he mentioned with admiration the quote, one state in which one can observe at least weak beginnings of a better conception. The American Union categorically refuses the immigration of unhealthy elements and excludes the immigration of certain races. In these respects, I'm still quoting from Adolf Hitler, America already pays obeisance to the characteristic, and he uses this German term, it doesn't really translate very well, but America is paying obeisance to the characteristic folkish concept of the state. What is that pure folk that the Germans would try to protect? One prominent German historian, Warhol Drescher, in his 1936 book, The Supremacy of the White Race, basically expressed what the Nazis assumed was the correct historical view, that the founding of the United States was, quote, the first fatal turning point in the worldwide rise of white supremacy. It's a Nazi historian. Now again, the Nazis have an agenda. The Nazis have a certain ideological set of ideas about race. But when they look to the United States, the example of the United States, the laws of the United States as an inspiration for their ideas and their laws and their view of history, this is really quite chilling. Now, talking specifically about how they began to appropriate some of the American material, Nazi lawyers were very much aware of what we call the Jim Crow laws that were put into place in the states after the Reconstruction period was ended. The Jim Crow laws were basically intended to separate the races and to subordinate anyone who was not among the so-called white race, however that was defined legally. The fact that Jews, this is again looking at the Nazi viewpoint, the fact that Jews were not recognizable simply by their skin color made the Nazis even more interested in other parts of American race law. And so sometimes people in the past have said, well, the Nazis didn't really implement the kinds of Jim Crow laws that we had in the United States. Well, that's partly true. They were aware of them. They were inspired in some ways by them. But because the race laws in the United States especially depended on this visible cue of persons of color, you can see the skin color, and Jews did not have that. In fact, they ridiculed the idea that apparently in America, Jews were Caucasians because they were not singled out. They looked primarily not so much at the Jim Crow laws, but at race-based immigration laws, race-based second-class citizenship practices and laws, and race-based anti-miscegenation laws, that is intermarriage, racial intermarriage. Whitman makes the statement that the Nazis certainly agreed with that in the early 20th century, the United States was not just a country with racism, it was the leading racist jurisdiction. The race laws in the United States were the primary place that they looked. They looked all around the world, and they could find things here and there, a little bit in South Africa and some other places, but nothing as extensive and nothing as interesting to them, especially to those conservative German lawyers who still at that point were wanting to hold on to what would be the rule of law, how they could circumnavigate, so to speak, certain laws like our constitutional law of the Reconstruction Amendments of citizenship and slavery and so forth, how they might be able, like we were able to, circumnavigate those things. And so, discussed and drafted over several years, the first of the Nazi race laws enacted and promulgated at Nuremberg in 1935 was the Reich Citizenship Law. And I'll just read it. These laws are short, but I'll just read the actual terminology. It was translated into English by the author of the book. Now, listen to the terminology. This is law number 1, the Reich Citizenship Law, part number 1. A national is any person who belongs to the Mutual Protection Association of the German Reich. In other words, a national is a person who lives here and who owes special duties in return. Part 2, nationality is acquired through the provisions of the law on membership in the Reich and the state. And so certain kinds of ideas about what you are if you're just a national. Law number 2, a Reich citizen is exclusively a national of German blood or racially related blood who demonstrates through his conduct that he is willing and suited to faithfully serve the German folk and Reich. The Reich citizen is the sole bearer of full political rights to be exercised according to the measure of the law. Now that's what they ended up with in the actual Nuremberg laws that went into effect in September 1935. Whitman shows how the Nazis who formulated the law were influenced, and again, he's quoting extensively, and we don't have time to read all these quotes by any means, but he's quoting extensively, and the book is really, really fascinating. They were influenced by U.S. Indian law. Okay, Indians they would have corresponded to the nationals. They lived in the country, but they did not have the same rights of citizenship. They were influenced by anti-Chinese and Japanese legislation. They were influenced by how the United States treated the Filipinos, for example, and the Puerto Ricans after the Spanish-American War. Those were now parts of the United States, but those people were not to be granted full citizenship. They were nationals, they were American nationals, but they did not have the same rights. And so the Nazis were drawing directly from those things as far as their ideas of how they were going to deal with people who lived in the country, but who were not, in their view, eligible for full citizenship because you had to be of the German race. So they discussed these and other measures extensively in their meetings. The U.S. Immigration Act of 1924, for example, which they definitely quoted from a lot in their meetings, was clearly race-based. It favored the Nordic whites of Northern and Western Europe over the undesirable races of Southern and Eastern Europe. That wasn't changed until the mid-1960s in the United States, but then now we have moved, again, circumnavigating some of the laws, quite frankly, to what I think is the most chilling part of the book, and we'll get to that at the very end. People find ways to get around what the law is. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had been constantly renewed, made even more restrictive in the 20th century. They're inspired by all of these things. The way that the United States circumnavigated the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution to create a category of second-class citizenship, again, was especially interesting to Nazi legal authorities, because what they wanted to do was to restrict the rights of Jews, Eastern Europeans, and persons of color. They were very interested, and they talked a lot in that meeting in 1934 about the ways that Americans were able to basically deny Black citizens of the United States the right to vote. With, you know, all the story about that, the poll taxes and the literacy tests and the grandfather clauses, all the things, the political primaries, all of that stuff that allowed them to deny the right to vote by these legal subterfuges, and the way that they treated the Puerto Ricans and the Filipinos. The second of the laws was the law of the protection of German blood and German honor. Read part of that. Marriages between Jews and nationals of German blood or racially related blood are forbidden. They're void. Actions to nullify such marriages are brought by the state prosecutor. Jews may not employ female nationals of German blood or racially related blood. In their household, Jews are forbidden to raise the Reich and national flag. However, they are permitted to display Jewish colors, which when that was read out in the Nuremberg meeting, all the Nazis just laughed at that. They can't raise the Nazi flag or the German flag, but they can raise the Jewish flag, which is what the Nazis were doing anyway. They were making them put signals that they were Jewish so that they could boycott their businesses and persecute them. And anybody who violated the laws would be to be prosecuted by hard labor. The aim of the Nuremberg laws was to safeguard Germany from race mixing, or as they called it, race defilement. The laws of most states of the United States, most states, not just the South, outlawed interracial marriage and were studied in great detail by the lawyers who eventually constructed the Nuremberg laws. And there's a lot of detailed material quoted from the notes of the planning meetings that led to Nuremberg. The aim was to prohibit miscegenation with Jews, because that's what it says in the law. Again, the reason for that is that Jewish people were not identifiable visibly immediately. The laws specifically talk about Germans marrying Jews, and they had to go into some detail of defining who a Jew was. Persons of color were clearly not German, and therefore were de facto excluded from intermarrying with Germans of pure blood. I'll close with this most disturbing piece. Perhaps the most disturbing parts of the book are focused on the conclusion that discusses what he calls the common law system that operates de facto in the American legal tradition. That's how judges and other politicians can force or make decisions based on the common understanding of the folk, the white citizens, that excluded and discriminated against persons of color despite constitutional law. A common law system like that of America is to have a system in which the tradition of the law traditions of the law do indeed have little power to ride herd on the demands of the politicians, and when the politics is bad, the law can be very bad indeed. The point is, if those who have the power in the political systems are able to control, manipulate those who have the judicial power, you can find all sorts of ways to circumnavigate any kind of legal any kind of laws that are on the books. He says also that American jurists do not have the influence to put the brakes on the projects of politicians who make their careers on tough on crime platforms. And then he says this in an appendix, actually a new preface that was done a couple of years after the current presidential election was in place. The supremacy of the rule of law was abandoned during the high era of American waste law, just as it was abandoned in Nazi Germany. And we ought to tremble when we see it creaking and shuddering in 2019. Darren?
Thank you, Dr. Foster. So I'm going to follow this up with a different book, and I'm hoping that can tie into a few of the things that you shared here. But I want to share my screen so I can present some slides, because it's a lot to cover, and I hope everybody can keep track. So let me do that. Let's see. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. So the book that I have is called The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, and America. It's by Timothy Snyder, a Yale historian. I'm also drawing from his article on Ivan Ilyin. It's called Ivan Ilyin's Putin's Philosopher of Russian Fascism. I'm not presenting the book because the book is making a few cases that aren't particularly relevant to our discussion today, but I am highlighting the information that is relevant for us today and doing my best to tie this into some of the things that Dr. Foster has already stated. Everything I shared can essentially be summed up with this, which is that fascist ideas are mobilized in order to infiltrate governments, militaries, and be used to blunt or dismantle democracies. From our reading of Snyder's book, he makes two relevant points. And the first one is that Vladimir Putin laid the groundwork for the return of fascism into Russia's government and achieved spreading its influence and ideology into the West. The second is that America is caught in what he calls the politics of inevitability. And I'll give a brief explanation of that. It's this belief that we are on this never-ending road toward progress, and that no matter what happens, we are moving forward for the better. In short, progress is inevitable, and Snyder believes this belief is not only unrealistic, but it is harmful because it leads us to the dangerous belief that ideas no longer matter, or that certain activities that should be red flags for us, for example, for today, endless cases of police brutality or other manifestations of white supremacy, that these things are just blips on the radar, right? That they will all eventually work themselves out. Capitalism gave us the market, and the market is always pushing us forward towards progress and eventually everybody experiencing happiness. Anything that is contrary to that is just these blips, right? They're not evidence that we are not moving forward, that America is steeped in this sense that progress is inevitable. Why is this relevant? I want to start with the ideas that undergird fascism for that first point concerning Russia and Vladimir Putin. So Vladimir Putin laid the groundwork for the return of fascism. We said this, but how did this happen? First, Putin implements the thinking of Ivan Ilyin. He's a person who lived from 1883 to 1954, a Christian. Some may disagree with that, but a Christian, Russian, religious and political philosopher. He lived during the time of the Bolsheviks revolution and of course World War I and World War II. And he, in 1922, is expelled from Russia and is a political refugee in Germany. But during this time, when he's expelled, he takes a visit to Italy, and there he was inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, as well as the coup that happened there. But more importantly, from 1922 to 1938, he lived as a political refugee in Germany, and there was inspired by Hitler's seizure of power. During this time, he writes a book entitled On Resistance to Evil by Force. And this book is a defense for fascism. It builds on his dissertation, in which Eileen argues that, as we see in Genesis, before God creates everything, God is perfect. But once God created human beings and allowed them to exist as individuals, this opened up the door for evil. And God is waiting for a righteous person or philosopher or leadership to rise up and force the world, the humans, the individuals back into submission. Right? So that God, before human existence, is in this perfect space. But once he creates human beings, Eileen interprets this as God trying to have some sort of completion of himself. God opens up the door for evil for various reasons, because of human passion, because humans can't deal with the factual experience and history. And that once God decided that, he essentially ruined everything. For Eileen, it would be best summed up that God is the one who commits the original sin. So when we go from here, Snyder writes in an article about Eileen that Eileen essentially concludes that Christianity actually meant the call of the right-seeing philosopher to apply decisive violence in the name of love. Right? So for Eileen, you have to engage in violence or whatever means to bring these individuals back into submission, because God is waiting for this person to rise up. In light of this, Eileen also writes, and this is Snyder reflecting on him, that the fascist seizure of power, reflecting on Mussolini and Hitler, was an act of salvation. And you see him start advocating for a Russian Christian fascism. And in Eileen's mind, democracies equal individualism, and these fascist regimes, they rise up and are agents of God that must use violence to bring these individuals into submission. And then he is quoted for saying that the Nazis embodied a spirit that Russians must also share. Right? And I hope it's not lost on us to see just, again, the ideas, if we wanted to tie it into what Dr. Foster was presenting, it's not necessarily a direct connection, but if you have what's going on amongst the Nazis being inspired by America, and then you have a philosopher who is pushed out or expelled by his country, and he goes amongst Nazi Germany, is inspired by the things that are going on there. And then he takes this in order to create this Russian Christian fascism in the books that he writes and this propaganda that he promotes. I think the connections are surely there. But what this comes to, I guess, in practical terms for him, is that democracies, be they the Soviet Union or those in Europe, need to be overthrown, even violently overthrown, in order to establish unity and totality, because that's what God wants. And now, I can't see everybody's face, but going to Snyder's point, many of us may think, well, this just sounds really crazy. This is random philosopher. He's dying in 1954. I can't believe he believed these things about Christian faith and about God. We are a Christian. Our religion is built and rooted inside of love, not violence. I don't know exactly what your impressions of this might be, but I would assume that most of us would think this is wild and insane. But Snyder's second point that we started with is that ideas matter and that we can't write them off because they sound crazy or because we have this ingrained belief in progress. And that Eileen dies in 1954, but in 2005, his ideas are resurrected and used to undergird the platform of Vladimir Putin extensively. And he shows all the ways that Putin uses this. But that is of importance for the reasons that I'm about to show. So Putin, if we keep that in the back of our minds, that Eileen is being used for this purpose, some of us may be aware of some of these things, but I want to just bring them out from the book for those who are not. What Snyder points out in the book is that these ideas that Putin grabs from Eileen are rooted in an ideology, yes, but also a spirituality, right? This isn't just another grab for power, just out of, a greedy intention or a lustful intention for power for people. It is that, but it's also rooted in this spirituality and a view of God and how the world should function. So when Vladimir Putin pulls this out, he is undergirding his regime with this spiritual resource. And what it ends up happening is, for those who are aware of anything concerning the European Union, in the 1990s, the European Union is formed, and it starts to flourish more or less. And in response to this, again, building off of Eileen and his views of democracy, in the late 2011 and early 2012, Putin made public a new ideology, defining Russia in opposition to this model of Europe. So he becomes aware of the European Union, and he establishes this thing that you see there called the Eurasian Union. And it's intentionally built to be in opposition to the EU. The European Union required European nations, among other things, to establish democracies. And so this was expanding throughout Europe, and many countries would do meet the certain expectations of the European Union to join. And what Snyder says is that as they're trying to join and as they start to succeed, whether it's financially or through the rule of law, all of this is communicating to Russians that democracies are a success instead of a failure. So Putin has to establish this rival, the Eurasian Union, in order to try to collect those nations that have not joined the European Union at this point, as well as to begin engaging in ways to break it apart. And this is where we see what many of us know as the Brexit, right? That Russia, Putin, the Russian leadership started engaging in cyber warfare in order to instigate Britain's departure from the EU. And I won't go into that too deeply, but they do a lot of the things that we'll talk about here soon. But the best example of Putin and Russia setting themselves up against democracies, Snyder says, is best represented in Ukraine. And he says this is also a very clear example of Eileen's thinking coming forward. So Ukraine is a country that is Russia's neighbor, sharing their border, planned to join the European Union, and was making steps to do so. They hoped that it would help them to have a stronger rule of law. Russia wanted to hinder this and work to put their own person in leadership over the Ukraine. This is Viktor Yanukovych. I think it was in 2004, Russia steals the election for Yanukovych. He's embarrassed because all the news gets out. It's shown to be a fraud of an election. So they run the election again, somebody else wins. So Russia brings in Paul Manafort, some may know his name, an American political strategist. And Manafort uses a similar political strategy from the Republican Party in America in order to secure Yanukovych's victory in 2010. Again, the borrowing of ideas from America in order to establish something in another country. During this time, Yanukovych actually promised that he would sign an association agreement with the EU. So part of his campaign or part of his establishment as the president is we are going to join the EU or start the process of doing that. And so many people in Ukraine are excited about this. They're hoping that this is going to change the direction of their nation. And then in November 2013, through threats and promises, Putin was able to induce the Ukrainian president, Yanukovych, not to sign the association agreement. So he starts again, just like with the Eurasian Union, working in ways to block nations from becoming democracies or joining this larger democratic union of the EU. This sparks a mass protest. I won't get into Paul Manafort just yet. But a mass protest in response to Yanukovych. And many Ukrainians are revolting. Russia uses this as a time to instigate this civil unrest through cyber attacks. Again, the same thing they did in Britain. A sniper massacre occurs. Yanukovych flees to Russia. This is all under the claim that a coup is happening, is what Yanukovych is claiming. But it is understood that the coup is happening from Russia, and yet he flees to the very nation that he claims is trying to overthrow. Which is very weird. But Putin uses this as an opportunity to invade the Ukraine by sending Russian soldiers in to further instigate violence. They would hide amongst the people and pretend to be local partisans and thus endanger actual citizens. And then after that, Putin sends Russian troops and they invaded the Ukraine multiple times. And Snyder writes that as soldiers received their mobilization orders for the invasion of the Ukraine's Crimean province in January 2014, all of Russia's high-ranking bureaucrats and regional governors were sent a copy of Eileen's Our Tasks. And there he shows up again. Right? And again, Snyder has this all throughout of his work, showing all the ways that Eileen was used to bolster this as a spiritual resource for attacking and doing the works that Russia is doing to invade this nation that's trying to become a democracy. Okay. So to start wrapping this up, why is this relevant? How does it tie in with some of the things we've been sharing before? First, the spirituality of Vladimir Putin, Vladimir Putin's government draws heavily upon the self-proclaimed Christian philosophy of Eileen that essentially perceives the use of violence or any other methods that establish fascism and totality as a divine mandate to assist God. Right, so they're working in their eyes, this is the work of God. Using violence to bring about totality, to root out individualism and democracies is the work and expectation of God, or the thing that God would hope for, I guess, is a better way to word it. This includes, when we talk about violence or warfare, it doesn't necessarily have to be physical. It includes cyber warfare, as we saw for the EU. It includes political infiltration in the Ukraine, as Yanukovych was put into the presidency by Putin or by Russia. And then it includes they brought in Paul Manafort to work with Yanukovych. And then finally includes the military infiltration that we saw in the Ukraine. Soldiers hiding amongst civilians. to instigate civil unrest, or soldiers being directly mobilized, being sent the work of Eileen in order to undergird this activity. But the second thing, and I hope this drives it home in terms of being relevant for us in America, is that after the revolt in the Ukraine, Yanukovych fled to Russia, which was expected because he was a puppet. But Paul Manafort came back to America to assist in helping America's current administration. In March 2016, he ran the presidential campaign of our current administration. In June 2016, Paul Manafort sat with Jared Kushner, other members of the current administration, and the Russians in order to plan how to hurt the Clinton campaign. And it's very interesting considering these things in light of the cyber warfare that we know that Russia implemented against us, whether it be through Facebook or Twitter, and the ways they influenced the presidential election of that time. So all of these things all tie back to Eileen, and not necessarily that this was the intended result of somebody who died in 1954, but that Putin resurrects these ideas to undergird his desires and to give it a spiritual resonance that has impacted the EU, that impacted the Ukraine, and now is being used to impact America. All the way from the leadership, likely down to the military. And then to use a quote from Snyder, he says, the goals can basically be summed up in this quote from a Russian commander. The Russian commander sent to oversee the second major movement of Russian troops into Ukraine to the southeastern provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk in summer 2014, described the war's final goal in terms that Eileen would have understood. Quote, if the world were saved from demonic constructions such as the United States, it would be easier for everyone to live. And one of these days, it will happen. Conclusion, fascist ideas, the ideas from Eileen and others, are mobilized in order to infiltrate governments, militaries, and be used to blunt or dismantle democracies. So before I just close it off and hand it back over to you, Josh, or if you have anything, Dr. Foster, I think the ways that we see this tie in, if it isn't already apparent, is that if these governments are being infiltrated with the intention of destroying the democracies, and we're seeing that Manafort, I forgot to mention that Manafort actually went over to Ukraine and used the strategies from the United States. They called it the Southern Strategy in order to help Yanukovych be elected. So he takes the strategies from the US, uses them over there, but he's brought over there by Russia. And then he's brought back to help with the current administration. We are forced to deal with the question of what is the intention behind bringing him in to help with the current administration. And if those same strategies, the cyber warfare and the military infiltration was being used over there, we are forced to ask, in what ways are those being employed over here, especially in light of what Dr. Reese and Josh was sharing, and how we're seeing from what Dr. Foster shared, that these models are being analyzed, and that there's just this network of ideas in motion that is occurring on a global level that are seeking to subjugate individuals, put individuals in second-class citizenry, and for Eileen to destroy democracies. That's it.
So I want to say thank you really quick to Darren and Dr. Foster. Before we move into our breakout groups, I want to ask you guys a question that kind of helps center us, and I think it will help in the discussion. So one of the things you mentioned, Dr. Foster, in the book that you were talking about, in Hitler's American Model, that there's this common law and these traditions, even though there's written law, right? And so there's something written in stone that says the Constitution or the laws of the state that say X, but then there's this common law and these traditions that people work off of that oftentimes go against what's written publicly. And then Darren, you mentioned in a very similar sense, how there's these ideologies that are persistent among the current system. And so you can look at how things are working and you can say, but the system says it should do X, but why is it not doing what it says it should do? And you're saying, well, there's these other systems at play, there's these other ideas that are influencing that. So with those two things kind of held in tension, like, what is the response in a church system? Like, in a spiritual way, how do we acknowledge these? Especially since Eileen says this is what he believed, that his ideology was a Christian mandate. And even, talking about what's happening in southern places, when we talk about bringing about the way of the South, that there's a Christian response in that. So what is the spiritual nature to combating this common law, but also these ideas that undergird that, I don't know, in a way perpetuate violence, because that's what he was seeking, like by any means necessary. I mean, Eileen sounds very Malcolm X-like. It doesn't matter what you have to do to get the world back on track, we're willing to do that. So how do you guys respond to that, to kind of help our breakout groups to kind of think deeply about this and think in the frame of the spirit about these things?
Well, I can say a couple of things that are perhaps not as helpful as you're looking for. I sometimes despair about this, because just as Darren has illustrated, this philosophy that Ilian was promulgating, he saw as essentially Christian. And it seems to me that the approach that the Spain Center, that Jerry has sort of laid out, Jerry Taylor has laid out in the Spain Center's approach, especially, but even many years before that in the Racial Unity Leadership Summits and other places, that this is primarily, for Christians, it is primarily a spiritual warfare, a spiritual issue. And somehow the hearts and minds of Christians have to be, and I know it's, a lot of times people say, well, you can't just educate people or give people a lot of facts. Well, I understand that. I am an educator. But I also know that, I know that there are a lot of people who know a lot of stuff who are evil people. But I also know that in the context of the church, of the Christian church, what we have often called education can degenerate into simply facts. But on the other hand, what we're really doing in the context of the church with what we call education is transformation, spiritual formation. And it seems to me that spiritual formation piece has got to be central. And we're just going to have to simply deal with, hear, understand, grasp. Reverend Johnson's story. I wish every person in every predominantly white church could hear what he did today, because he told a story in his own life of transformation. He told a story of anger and despair, and I guess you could say in some cases early on pretty aggressive behavior. But he also showed a transformation, but he has not backed off 1 inch from godly justice and action. And so I really appreciated what he said, and I think maybe that's the key for me, that it has to be grounded in spiritual prayer and meditation, like what the whole business of these groups have been, but then there has to be godly action that comes from it. That's pretty generic, but that's That's what I'd say right now. Darren, what would you say in your context?
Yeah, I think going off what you mentioned, Josh, one of the things that Snyder says that Eileen did is he goes to passages where Jesus is clearly talking about loving an enemy and being sacrificial, and he completely reworks it through a different lens, right? And he doesn't actually deal with what's there. And what Eileen keeps promoting is this rejection of history, that you need somebody beyond history. You need something, this person that will will themselves to power and really function from this fictional space, because humans can't really deal with history. That's what leads us down this road of individualism and passions and evil, as he keeps saying. And what Snyder tries to put forth is we have to continue to bring the facts to the table and truly wrestle with what's there. And I think what we see with Eileen's wrestle or disregard for history is similar to his disregard for the teachings of Jesus. And I think oftentimes in the churches, that can be the call to love enemy, the call to pursue justice. All of these things that are right there in our passages are right there in the teachings. As Dr. Foster said, there is no, or a lot of times in my experience, there's little spiritual formation built around those things to shape us to be people who are inclined towards justice and establishing justice. And just as we see with the American model for Hitler, the culture can often override the laws or work around the laws. And oftentimes the culture of the church that has been established, whether it be through America or various other means, becomes a religion in and of itself that surrounds these Christian principles and laws, if we want to call them, but it's not Christian at all, because it has stopped wrestling truly with the teachings of Jesus, wrestling with the history and legacy of the American nation or the nation that it's in, and really saying, how do these teachings of Jesus come into conflict with these experiences? It just wants to treat them as blips on the radar or treat them as if they're non-existent, and really devolve into culture instead of discipleship.
Thank you both. Thank you. So we're about to break into our breakout groups. We're about to have that portion. And so I want you to take what you've heard today, these conversations, this material, and especially what was just recently said from Dr. Foster and Darren in terms of the spiritual application, because that's where we're looking for answers to come from. We're not trying to make this a socio-political scheme. We recognize the Spirit has to do something within us. We have to be prayerful. We have to be in a state of meditation. We have to be listening for God, and we want ideas to flow from that space. So with that, when you're in your breakout groups, I want you to keep that first and foremost, and if we need to, we call each other back to that. So you'll be in the breakout groups. What I want you to do in your groups, somebody needs to be the scribe. They will take down the ideas, but I want you guys to wrestle through those so that you get to one idea. We're going to have about 20 minutes to do that. We'll come back at like 6:10. So you'll have a little bit less than 20 minutes to wrestle through that. We'll come back, have 5 minutes. We'll need a speaker. You'll communicate your one idea that you wrestle it down to, but you'll also need to send that idea via email to the crawlspancenter@gmail.com, and I'll put that in the chat for everybody to see. So I'll also type these instructions in there.